Motives of Thomas Harris aside, director Jonathan Demme brings his own critical take of America to his film version and plants a few seeds to that effect. The first thing that drew this to my attention was the use of US flags in relation to the serial killer Jamie Gumb, who was also known as Buffalo Bill to the investigators hunting him. A huge US flag is draped over the stored car where Clarice finds the severed head of Bill's former lover, Benjamin Raspail. Another is found on the wall right above the desk in his basement lair, and a tiny one is seen in the smashed window after Clarice shoots and kills him. That little flag, previously hidden in the dark, is now exposed to the sunlight, a bit like the light of Revelation, I suppose. At first I took these US flag instances to simply be a sort of message of, never mind the American dream, here's the American nightmare of serial murder. But then I spotted two other things that made me reinterpret the potential message. The first is that Bill picks up a gun that's hidden underneath a blanket that has huge swastika designs all over it. I don't think such a blanket would even be available to buy publicly, so unless it was some rare World War II Nazi memorabilia item that Bill had found and purchased through some specialist dealer, or maybe a Native American design because they use swastikas too, then he would have had to have knitted the design himself. Either way, the implication is that he has a neo-Nazi side to him. Does he actually sleep under this thing? But it's also noteworthy that in the constantly moving handheld shot where we get maybe a 2-second glimpse of this blanket, the US flag above Bill's desk is visible as well. Now, since the war on terror that followed the World Trade Center attacks, comparing America to Nazis has become commonplace in movies, but Silence of the Lambs was filmed in 1991. Such comparisons were a lot more rare back then. Harris's novel never struck me as a critique of America, but rather a critique of violent human pathology, devoid of national identity or historical setting. This blanket was a prop designed for the film, and undoubtedly with the director's consent and approval. Then I spotted another set detail that more or less cleared up the mystery. A poster shows a face blindfolded by the words, "business as usual." A swastika is popping out from behind the head, and the phrase, "Open your eyes, America," is written underneath. Now that's a contradiction. Why would Buffalo Bill have a swastika blanket and a US flag, yet also pin up a poster that warns of an ideological or perhaps economic link between Nazism and America? How can he be a neo-Nazi and somebody who warns people about neo-Nazism? It's not like he's a political activist, and if he was, nobody would read this poster in the basement but him. Instead, I think these details have been snuck in as a straight message from director to audience, rather than being a literal representation of what Bill gets up to in his lair. This is supported by an interview that director Jonathan Demme did for Rolling Stone. The article claims that when Demme was asked about the blanket, he replied, quote, "There's a certain theoretical relationship and perhaps practical relationship that exists between fascination with Nazism, American patriotism, and an impulse toward violence." End quote. Now, I disagree with Demme on that theory. The notion of nationalism being underpinned by hate and thus violence is contradicted by the many nation-states of the world that are peaceful. Some of them don't even have armies. And the fact that violence is equally associated to colonialism and communism. In the same way that a lot of people claim that the word socialism being part of the words National Socialism, which was the name of the Nazi party, in the same way that a lot of people claim that that is incidental and that the Nazis weren't really socialists, I would say that the national aspect is pretty much incidental as well. It was the elitism and racism that seemed to be the primary features of Nazism. Some underhanded suggestions of racism in America are present in the film too, but there's only a few of them. 2 out of 3 guards who watch over Lecter and the other psychos in the hospital are black. One of them has put up an African head carving on a board. A little carving of an Indian in a canoe with paddles is seen outside Frederica Bimmel's house, like the residue of a land having been taken over by settlers. And Clarice's best friend Ardelia is a black woman moving up the FBI ranks like herself. Perhaps more prominent is the general depiction of the small down-and-out towns of America, the kind of places movies don't visit very often. As Lecter outlines, a major factor in Clarice's pathology is her hatred of her own economic and geographical background.
Do you know what you look like to me with your good bag and your cheap shoes? You look like a rube. A well-scrubbed, hustling rube. But you're not more than one generation from poor white trash, are you, Agent Starling?
And during the story, she's forced to revisit these kinds of neighbourhoods, being that Bill's victims are often from such places. The houses and yards may be big, but they're dilapidated and full of junk and old furnishings. A broken basketball hoop is prominent here. Clarice finds the limited education and limited aspirations of the town dwellers sort of repulsive. She's in denial of her own background and is becoming perhaps a bit of a snob. In the scene of Catherine's abduction, she's listening to the song American Girl, maybe hinting that she represents the average run-of-the-mill American girl herself, who tends to be the target of serial killers. Though I did find it a slight contradiction that Catherine is also the daughter of a senator and thus ought to be living in a higher economic bracket. Maybe the novel explains this, but I haven't read it in quite a few years. Nevertheless, the daughter of a senator plot point allows the film to delve a bit more into America's political scene. For one thing, Catherine is given a greater chance of survival by virtue of her mother's ability to quickly arrange a bargain with Lecter. Not that Lecter is willing to play by her rules, but you get the point. When she wrestles control of the investigation out of Crawford's hands, the guy who informs Crawford has a George Bush Sr. photo behind him, and on his shelf a copy of the Seymour Hersh book, The Price of Power. That book was a critique of Nixon's presidency and the influence over Nixon by Henry Kissinger. So maybe there's a little statement being made about Kissinger and George Bush Sr. After all, the Kissinger influence didn't end with Nixon, it carried on through several more presidencies. We then see Crawford's replacement, Paul Krendler, very specifically framed against a painting of a politician, but I'm not sure who it is. The political stuff doesn't go much further in Silence of the Lambs, at least not in the movie version, but the corruption of politics does come a lot more into force in the follow-up novel, Hannibal. Incidentally, as Catherine is driving, though Bill is waiting for her near her apartment, we can see on the road that the headlights of another car are sort of hovering back and forth like the eyes of a predator in waiting. Like many young women, she's naive about the dangerous male predators around her. That naivety is present in Frederica's friend too.
Is that a good job, FBI agent? You get to travel around and stuff? I mean, better places than this.
Sometimes you do.
I wouldn't exactly call looking at the bodies of serial killer victims better places. Through Clarice, we experience a little bit of the pain that's necessary for gaining a deeper understanding of recreational murder. Upon first seeing the photos of Bill's victims, it's easy to assume that Bill is a sadist, but we later learn that the skin removals are post-mortem. I suspect Thomas Harris deliberately allowed us to make the sadism assumption. The film doesn't entirely bypass sexual sadism though. Its presence and ugliness is presented as Miggs claiming to have bit his wrists to commit suicide, and then throwing semen in Clarice's face as he shouts, "Look at the blood." Like typical sexual sadists, he has pathologically fused sexual excitement and violence together so intensely that the two bodily fluids may as well be interchangeable. It establishes the intensity of sexual sadism quickly and without being too offensive or disturbing. Having established that point, the film is then able to move on from the subject of sadism to more interesting and palatable territory. Clarice's training for the job would inevitably involve her being exposed to some of the FBI sexual homicide archives, including the confessions, photos, and video and audio recordings made by serial killers of their own crimes. Profiling expert John Douglas, whom the Jack Crawford character is partially based on, has been reported as using a particularly disturbing audio recording of the torture, rape and murder of Shirley Ledford by Lawrence Bittaker. He was one half of the sexual sadist Toolbox Killers duo who murdered 5 teenage girls in 1979. Scott Glenn, who plays Jack Crawford in Silence of the Lambs, spent time with John Douglas in preparation for his role, and he admits that the exposure he was given to real cases of serial murder emotionally scarred him, particularly the Bittaker tape, and it converted him into supporting the death penalty. I mention the Bittaker tape here because it will become relevant to the film's deeper themes later in this video. In the film, Clarice's exposure to the horrors of serial murder aren't presented in terms of classroom training, but rather the actual examination of a dead body. Crawford didn't have to expose her to this at this point in her training, but we could take it as him putting the effort in to desensitize her so she can do a better job, or perhaps even slightly traumatize her so she'll be even more motivated to assist him in the hunt. Either way, it allows the film to take us on the same journey of dark discovery. Actually, that very metaphor of a journey into darkness is literally depicted in the lead-up to the funeral home scene. Clarice and Crawford discuss their profiling of Bill, and the scene closes with the vehicle travelling through a dark tunnel. From a lighting technician's position, it would have been much easier to just shoot this scene without the tunnel, so I think its inclusion is symbolic, a tunnel into a dark psychological place. The exposure and desensitization process is a central motive on the part of writer Thomas Harris. It's like he sees a society that is largely blindfolded to the reality of recreational murder, and in turn he uses fiction entertainment to gently pull those blindfolds off for the reader. Though he doesn't publicly talk about his creative process, comparisons have been made between the characters in his films and real-life cases of serial murder in America. The Buffalo Bill strategy of pretending to have a broken arm in order to lure his target victims into his trap was used by murderer Ted Bundy. The imprisonment of captured women in a deep pit in his basement was done by Gary Heidnik, who kept women chained up as sex slaves. The creation of a suit made out of women's skin bears resemblance to cannibal Ed Gein, who fashioned clothing and furniture out of victims' skin and bones. And while the Lecter character is largely symbolic and unrealistic, some of his traits and activities are found in real-world cases. For example, many serial murderers do have very high IQs. One of them, Ted Bundy, is reported to have been consulted in the hunt for the Green River murderer, just as Lecter is consulted in other ongoing cases. And Ted Bundy escaped from prison twice. Lecter makes his own genius prison escape in Silence of the Lambs. So it seems that there is a lot of emphasis in Silence of the Lambs of taking the viewer on a dark discovery of the hidden horrors of America and the human mind. However, in my opinion, serial murder isn't an American phenomenon, as is easy to assume from watching the movie. For a variety of reasons, serial murder in the United States simply gets more attention. There are many documented cases of sexual homicide in South and Central America, Europe and beyond, sometimes with individual killers racking up hundreds of victims before they're caught. Less efficient policing and less political emphasis on the need to catch these killers may contribute to these very high body counts. Under the Soviet Union, for example, officials wanted to portray their communist regime as being more socially efficient than it was, and to also portray serial murder as being somehow a product of Western capitalism. The result, Andrei Chikatilo murdered over 50 women and children over a 12-year period in Russia, while the public were given no state warnings about the predator among them. I think Jonathan Demme may have discarded his notion of serial murder violence, Nazism and American patriotism being arbitrarily linked together if he'd paid attention to the global phenomena of serial murder, which spans near enough every country and political system. In short, serial killers, while demonstrably coming from more poverty-stricken backgrounds in general, are not usually motivated by politics.